On a freezing night in early 1989, two young men moved silently along a canal on the edge of East Berlin, convinced that history had finally shifted in their favor. They had heard rumors that the order to shoot had been softened, that the regime was losing its nerve, that the border guards were tired of killing. Chris Gerfoy was 20 years old, a waiter and aspiring mechanic, born and raised in the German Democratic Republic, a country that called itself a workers' paradise but built concrete and barbed wire to keep its own workers from leaving. He and his friend came to a stretch of the border along the Brits Canal between Treptow in the east and Neukölln in the west, a patch of darkness they believed might be less guarded now that the Cold War was changing. They crawled through the first fence, cut through a signal barrier, and reached the last line of metal and concrete. For one brief moment, the boys could almost see the lights of West Berlin reflected in the canal water, a different world just a few meters away. Then, floodlights snapped on. Sirens screamed across the strip known as the Todesstreifen, the death strip, and the guards, still under clear orders, opened fire. Bullets tore through the night. Gerfoy was hit in the chest and collapsed at the base of the fence, dying where he fell. He would be remembered as the last person shot dead at the Berlin Wall, killed on February 5, 1989, just 9 months before that same wall would suddenly be full of laughing people dancing on top of it. For Americans watching the end of the Cold War, this contrast is almost hard to believe. In February, the wall is still killing. By November, teenagers are chipping off pieces of that same wall with hammers as souvenirs on live television. Behind that whiplash change are stories of final escapes, the last desperate runs through rivers and forests before the Iron Curtain split open, and the way Western technology and organization turned those escapes into something the Soviet system could no longer handle. If you zoom out from the canal where Chris died, the map of Europe in 1989 looks like it is full of cracks. Communist regimes are under pressure everywhere. Poland is negotiating with solidarity. Hungary is experimenting with reforms. And even within the Soviet Union, Gorbachev is loosening the screws with glasnost and perestroika. But the borders of the Eastern Bloc, the physical Iron Curtain, are still supposed to be solid. Barbed wire, minefields, watchtowers. For decades, those lines were drawn with such brutality that people didn't just fear them, they feared thinking about crossing them. And then, almost overnight, one stretch of that Iron Curtain begins to come apart, not in Berlin, not in some dramatic tank clash, but on the border between Hungary and Austria. A small country with a crumbling socialist economy starts dismantling a fence, and the ripple effects will terrify hardliners from East Berlin to Bucharest. In the spring of 1989, Hungarian leaders made a decision that, on paper, looked technical. The border fortifications along the Austrian frontier were obsolete, corroded, and expensive to maintain. They chose to begin removing the old electronic alarms and barbed wire under the cover of modernization and in line with a Helsinki-style language of building trust in Europe. On May 2, 1989, Hungarian Foreign Minister Gyula Horn and Austrian Foreign Minister Alois Mock met at the border for a photo opportunity. They took bolt cutters to a section of the rusty fence, grinned for the cameras, and posed as they cut through the mesh, a symbolic act that state television beamed across Europe. To Western audiences, it looked like a hopeful gesture, another sign that the Cold War might be ending without a shot fired. To East German citizens sitting in cramped apartments, secretly watching West German TV they weren't supposed to receive, it looked like something else entirely, a hole. If Hungary dismantled her border with Austria, then the Iron Curtain would be open at one point, and where there is one opening, even a small one, people will start to move. By the summer of 1989, tens of thousands of East Germans took vacations to Hungary. Officially, they were tourists going to Lake Balan, a favorite holiday spot where East and West could mingle under the watchful eyes of party officials. In reality, more and more of them were thinking exactly the same thought. If we reach Hungary, maybe we never have to go back. Newspapers and broadcasts in the West reported that the Hungarian border installations were being removed, that the fences were rotting in piles of metal, that patrols were becoming more relaxed. Those news stories weren't meant as escape manuals, but that is exactly how they were read in some East German living rooms. Secretly, families whispered plans, while East Berlin television talk shows pretended nothing had changed. In Budapest, the effect was immediate. Camping grounds, church basements, and improvised shelters filled up with East German tourists who had quietly decided they would not return home when their visas expired. Some slept in their trabants in parking lots for weeks. Others pitched tents in hidden corners of city parks. They were stuck in a strange limbo, technically guests of Hungary, politically unwanted by their own state. The Hungarian government saw the numbers climbing. Budapest knew that under a 1969 treaty with East Germany, it was bound to stop these people from fleeing west. But it also knew that the world was watching and that Gorbachev's Soviet Union had no appetite for another bloodbath over a closed border. This is where Western technology begins to quietly flex. Every flight of refugees, every leaked image of piled-up barbed wire, every interview with a young East German saying, "I just want a future for my children," is captured by cameras, bounced off satellites, relayed by news agencies, and shown in homes from New York to Los Angeles to Hamburg to Vienna. In the 1950s, mass escapes like this could be hidden or spun. In 1989, when CNN and European broadcasters could go live from border crossings and embassies, the old information control tools looked crude. The Soviet leadership and its East German clients suddenly faced a world where the drama at some rural checkpoint near Sopron could hit American living rooms in real time. On August 19, 1989, a small event near the town of Sopron became a turning point. Local Hungarian activists and the Pan-European Union, a pro-integration movement led by figures like Otto Habsburg, organized what they called the Pan-European Picnic. The idea was to raise a gate in the border fence for a few hours to symbolize the dream of a Europe without walls. On paper, it was a peaceful, almost quaint demonstration. Speeches about unity, folk music, a gate briefly opened between Hungary and Austria. Hungarian and Austrian border guards were told to expect a few dozen people, maybe 100, gathered in a field. But the rumor mill among East German vacationers had been spinning for days. Somebody had heard that at this picnic, the border would actually be open. No minefields, no alarms, no dogs. Just a gate, some distracted guards, and a short sprint to the Austrian side. By the time the event began, hundreds of East Germans had quietly converged on the area. They stayed back in the tree line while officials gave speeches and local people clapped politely. Everyone waited for the signal that the gate would be opened. When a simple wooden barrier was lifted, it was as if a dam broke. Roughly 600 to 700 East Germans surged forward from the hillside and charged down the slope toward Austria, some holding children in their arms, others dropping bags and simply running. Hungarian border guards like Lieutenant Colonel Arpad Bella stood there in shock. According to his own later accounts, he had orders, he had weapons, he had years of training that said stop them at all costs. But he also had cameras on him, foreign observers on the ground, and a government in Budapest that had quietly signaled it did not want a massacre. So the guards did something that still feels almost miraculous. They looked away. They focused on checking the papers of Austrian guests at the picnic and let the East Germans pour through the open gate into a waiting world of Western reception camps, television crews, and West German diplomats ready with resettlement papers. In one afternoon, without a shot fired, the largest mass escape from East Germany since 1961 took place, not under the nose of Soviet tanks, but under the lenses of Western cameras and the watchful eyes of politicians who understood the power of images. For officials in East Berlin reading the reports the next day, this was more than an embarrassment. It was a sign that their whole system of border control could be rendered meaningless by a handful of decisions in Budapest and the existence of a media ecosystem they did not control. After the picnic, there was no going back to the old normal. East Germans kept coming. By August, it was estimated that around 60,000 citizens of the GDR were in Hungary, many of them refusing to return home. Hungarian leaders found themselves under immense pressure. On one side, the East German regime accused them of human trafficking under the cloak of humanitarianism, demanding that they stop the exodus and send the deserters back. On the other side, Western governments, Austria, West Germany, and quietly the United States, praised Hungary's humane approach and signaled that if Budapest took the risk of letting people go, help would be there to absorb them. In early September 1989, the Hungarian government made its choice. On the night of September 10 to 11, Budapest announced that it would open the border to Austria for East German citizens on its territory, effectively suspending the treaty that bound it to keep them locked in. That announcement raced across the airwaves. People heard it on Hungarian television with German subtitles. They heard it on West German broadcasts, on Radio Free Europe, on the grapevine in crowded camps near Budapest and Lake Balaton. Within hours, long lines of Trabants and Wartburgs formed at Hehia Shalom Nikolsdorf crossing. One report remembers a bright orange Trabant among the first to roll under the raised barrier, greeted by Austrian border guards who waved them through to cheers and tears. By September 12th, United Press International reported that more than 12,500 East German refugees had already been registered in Austria after crossing from Hungary, with thousands more on the way. West German authorities were preparing trains, buses, temporary shelters, and computer systems to process the flood piling up in temporary camps, assign people to reception centers, and move them onward into towns and cities across the Federal Republic. From the Eastern Bloc perspective, this was chaos. From the Western perspective, it was a test of systems. Telecommunications networks linked border posts in Austria to ministries in Bonn and Vienna. Databases at embassies and immigration offices began to fill with the names and birth dates of an entire migrating population, typed in by staff who had, for years, been planning what might happen when the Iron Curtain finally cracked. The East German regime tried to respond with old tools. They closed their border with Czechoslovakia for a time, tried to prevent travel to Hungary, denounced Western provocations. But the images kept coming. Crowds at Austrian border crossings, jubilant scenes on Western TV, ordinary Americans watching from their living rooms as tiny East German cars rolled into freedom under autumn skies. For officials in East Berlin reading the reports the next day, this was more than an embarrassment. It was a sign that their whole system of border control could be rendered meaningless by a handful of decisions in Budapest and the existence of a media ecosystem they did not control. While one escape route opened in the fields of Hungary, another front line of the last escapes ran straight through the Baroque heart of Prague. Czechoslovakia was still formally a communist state in 1989, but it was not East Germany. Travel rules were looser, and thousands of East Germans discovered that they could reach Prague relatively easily, then head for one particular address, the West German Embassy. In the summer of 1989, a trickle became a flood. People began camping in the gardens of the embassy, at first in tents and cars, then in hastily erected shacks and under plastic sheets as the lawns turned into a muddy sea of humanity. Pictures from that time showed children playing between parked Trabants, laundry hanging on improvised lines, entire families sleeping in hallways and stairwells. They were on foreign soil, technically, in a legal limbo that drove East German authorities insane. Citizens they still claimed, sleeping under the protection of a state they could not touch. On September 30th, 1989, West German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher flew to Prague to break the deadlock. He stepped out onto the balcony of the embassy's Lobkowitz Palace, looking down on a courtyard packed with thousands of desperate faces. In one of the most famous sentences of late Cold War history, he began to speak. His voice, broadcast through low-quality speakers and picked up by television crews, was half drowned by cheers. He said that the government of the Federal Republic had reached an agreement that the refugees would be allowed to travel to the West. He barely got the words out before the crowd exploded, drowning out the legal details, including the fact that the trains would technically pass through East German territory. Over the following days, special trains filled with East German refugees rolled out of Prague, through Dresden and other East German cities, and into the Federal Republic. People leaned from the windows, holding their children, crying and waving as they passed stations where those still trapped in the GDR watched in disbelief. In the weeks that followed, more and more people came. By early August, estimates suggest that around 60,000 East German citizens of the GDR were in Hungary, many of them refusing to return home. Again, look at this through the lens of systems. Here you have tens of thousands of people moving through a single building and a few train lines in a short span of time, yet the West German state and its allies were able to register them, feed them, house them, route them, almost in real time. In 1961, such a movement would have taken weeks to process. In 1989, with computer terminals in consulates, telex links to Bonn, and a bureaucracy that had trained for years on refugee crises, the Federal Republic could turn the chaos in the embassy garden into organized convoys of human hope. Unlike the Hungarian and Czech routes, many of these crossings left no video. No triumphant interviews, no footage for the evening news. Bodies washed up on the banks. Families never received confirmation of what had happened. Yet these silent escapes were part of the same story, the last surges of human beings trying to break through an order that was about to implode. And even here, far from the Western TV crews, the difference in systems mattered. Those who made it to Yugoslavia found UNHCR staff, Red Cross workers, and Western embassies that knew what to do with an East Bloc defector. There were procedures, camps, interviews, options to seek asylum in the United States, Canada, or Western Europe. On the other side of the Danube, at Romanian outposts, everything still ran on fear and folders. In Bucharest, secret police officers compiled lists of fugitives and tightened surveillance, convinced that control on paper could still guarantee control on the ground. By the fall of 1989, you have these different escape routes all flaring at once. Hungary and Austria seeing caravans of East German cars. Prague watching its embassy garden turn into a non-stop refugee camp. Romania pouring bullets into a river that fewer and fewer young people were willing to fear. For the Soviet Union's aging leadership, schooled in the brutal lessons of 1953, 1956, and 1968, it must have been a haunting déjà vu. But this time, they were facing not one uprising in one capital, but a kind of cascading system failure triggered by information and movement they no longer had the strength or the will to crush. In 1956, Moscow sent tanks to Budapest. In 1968, they rolled into Prague. In 1989, as refugee numbers from Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania hit Western newswires and filled Western consulates with data, Gorbachev signaled over and over that there would be no more Brezhnev doctrine, no more automatic invasions to save crumbling satellite regimes. That difference was not just moral, it was technological and strategic. The West had built, piece by piece, an infrastructure for handling exactly this kind of crisis. televised press conferences to reassure publics, computerized passport and visa systems, airlines and rail companies able to surge capacity on short notice, legal frameworks for asylum honed over decades of dealing with refugees from Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and Vietnam in the 1970s. The Eastern Bloc, in contrast, had built its capacity around stopping movement, not managing it. Its databases were tools of internal surveillance, not international integration. Its border systems were optimized to prevent departure, not to handle what would happen when people left anyway. So, as the last escapes of 1989 unfolded, American and Western planners were not shocked in the same way their Soviet counterparts were. They had war-gamed refugee surges. They had secure phone lines and early satellite links with embassies. They had intelligence assessments that saw in each escape not just tragedy, but evidence that the Cold War was being won in the realm of information and integration as much as in missiles and tanks. And then, on November 9, 1989, the dam burst at the most iconic spot of all. A confused announcement at a press conference in East Berlin, a spokesman saying, mistakenly, that new travel rules for East Germans were effective immediately, without delay, set off a wave of people heading for the Berlin Wall's checkpoints. The guards had no clear instructions. Crowds grew. Television cameras rolled. In the end, officers simply opened the barriers. People climbed on top of the wall, hugged, cried, handed flowers to border soldiers. Images that would have been inconceivable in February, when Chris Geffroy lay dying at the base of a fence, were now being broadcast live to tens of millions of homes around the world. For Americans, that night was the emotional payoff of everything they had watched all year. The grainy footage from the Hungarian border, the crowded garden in Prague, news segments about Romanians swimming the Danube. Now, the symbol at the heart of the Cold War was falling in a way that highlighted the West's greatest strengths: openness, communication, responsiveness. On the Soviet Union side, the shock went deeper than ideology. It was not just that they were losing satellites, it was that their entire model of control had failed in the face of networks their opponents had spent decades refining. Networks of cameras, broadcasters, embassies, humanitarian agencies, border posts, and databases, all of them ready to catch and carry the human waves as soon as the cracks opened. That is why the final escapes of 1989 still resonate so strongly when Americans watch them today. They are not just stories of brave individuals sprinting for a fence or diving into a dark river. They are also stories of competing civilizations, one that thought in terms of walls and orders to fire, and another that invested in information, logistics, and the legal right of people to move. When East German families drove their little Trabants through the Hungarian night towards the Austrian border, they were betting their lives that on the other side, someone would be ready to receive them. When East Germans climbed the fence into the garden of the West German embassy in Prague, they were trusting not just on one politician's promise, but on the existence of a whole Western system that could turn that promise into train schedules, housing assignments, and identity cards. When Romanians stepped into the icy currents of the Danube, they were moving toward a world where, if they survived, an international network of institutions, many backed, funded, or strongly supported by the United States and its allies, would recognize their claim to be more than just fugitives. In each case, the Soviet-style answer was to double down on fear. The Western answer was to scale up structure. That is the deeper technological story behind the final escapes of 1989, and it's why decades later, viewers in the United States can watch those old clips with a particular mix of pride, fascination, and curiosity. Pride because their country stood on the side of a system that could absorb and protect the people running through those last gaps in the Iron Curtain. Fascination because the collapse of that curtain was driven less by tanks and more by cameras, cables, and quiet bureaucrats at border posts typing new names into terminals as fast as they could. And curiosity, because behind every iconic image, a boy on the wall, a family crossing a field, a line of cars at a Hungarian checkpoint, there is a web of choices, technologies, and institutions that turned each escape from a lonely act into a world-shaping event.